The sound of water trickling over smooth stones was the only music Victoria Keller had heard for the past 3 hours as she knelt by Provo Creek, scrubbing her father's work shirts against the flat rock she had claimed as her own. The June sun beat down on the Utah Valley in 1878, turning the air thick and heavy, and she had hiked nearly 2 miles from the small homestead her family occupied on the outskirts of Provo to find this particular bend in the creek where the water ran clear and cold from the mountain snowmelt. She was 20 years old, unmarried despite her mother's persistent efforts, and content in her solitude as she worked through the pile of laundry that never seemed to diminish no matter how many times she made this journey. Victoria pushed a strand of dark hair from her forehead with the back of her wet hand, and reached for another shirt when something upstream caught her attention. At first, she thought it was a fallen log caught against the rocks, but logs did not wear dark leather vests or have arms that draped lifelessly into the rushing water. Her heart lurched into her throat as she dropped the shirt and scrambled to her feet, hiking up her skirts as she rushed through the shallow creek bed toward the figure sprawled half in and half out of the water. Blood stained the rocks around him crimson, and as Victoria drew closer, she could see it was a man, lying on his stomach with his face turned to the side, his hat missing and his dark hair matted with more blood. His shirt was torn and soaked through, whether from the creek or his wound she could not immediately tell, but the pallor of his skin told her he had lost a dangerous amount of blood. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his neck, searching for a pulse. There, faint but steady beneath her fingertips, he was alive. Victoria had grown up on the frontier, had helped her father doctor injured horses, and had once assisted in setting her brother's broken arm when he fell from the barn loft. But she had never encountered a man so grievously wounded and so utterly alone. She could see at least 3 bullet wounds in his back, the fabric of his shirt torn and black with powder burns. Whoever had shot him had done so at close range and had left him for dead. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through the peaceful sounds of the creek. "Sir, can you hear me?" He did not respond, his body utterly still except for the barely perceptible rise and fall of his breathing. Victoria looked around wildly, knowing she could not leave him here but equally aware that she had no way to move him on her own. He was tall, well over 6 feet if she had to guess, with broad shoulders and a muscular build that spoke of years working cattle or horses. There was no way she could carry him, and her wagon was back at the homestead. She made a split decision born of desperation, and began to drag him further from the water, grasping him under the arms and pulling with all her strength. He was impossibly heavy, and she managed only a few feet before her muscles screamed in protest, but it was enough to get him completely out of the creek and onto the grassy bank. She collapsed beside him, breathing hard, and began to examine his wounds more carefully. The bullets had entered his back, and she carefully rolled him onto his side to see if they had exited through his chest. 2 had, leaving ragged holes that oozed blood slowly, but the 3rd was still lodged somewhere in his body. She knew that trying to remove it herself could kill him, but leaving it in might do the same. What she needed was to stop the bleeding and get him to a doctor, but the nearest physician was in Provo proper, and she had no way to transport him there without going for help. Victoria stripped off her apron and began tearing it into strips, pressing the fabric against the worst of the wounds. "You hold on," she told him, though she did not know if he could hear her. "You hold on and do not you dare die on me, do you understand?" As if in response to her voice, the man's eyelids fluttered. She leaned closer, one hand still pressed firmly against the wound in his back, and watched as his eyes slowly opened. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and intense even in his weakened state, and they found her face with startling clarity. "Am I dead?" His voice was barely a whisper, rough and strained but coherent. "No," Victoria said firmly. "And you are not going to be if I have anything to say about it. What is your name?" He blinked slowly, as if trying to focus on her words. "Brennan," he managed. "Brennan Dawson." "Well, Brennan Dawson, I am Victoria Keller, and I need you to stay awake and talk to me while I try to stop this bleeding. Can you tell me who shot you?" His eyes drifted closed again despite her command, and she shook his shoulder gently. "No, you stay with me. Tell me who did this." "Dalton Gang," he breathed, and the name sent a chill down Victoria's spine despite the heat of the day. The Dalton Gang had been terrorizing towns across Utah and into Nevada for the past year, robbing banks and stages and leaving bodies in their wake. "I was tracking them. I am a deputy. They ambushed me near the canyon." Victoria's mind raced. If he was a lawman tracking the Dalton Gang, that meant the outlaws could still be nearby, and if they discovered their victim had survived, they might come back to finish the job. She pressed harder against his wounds, trying to stem the flow of blood that continued to seep through her makeshift bandages. "Where is your badge?" she asked. "Vest pocket," he said, and she could hear the pain threading through his voice now, as if the shock was beginning to wear off and the full agony of his injuries was making itself known. "Inside." She found it exactly where he said, a silver star that read Deputy Marshal, along with papers identifying him as Brennan Dawson, age 24, appointed to his position just 6 months prior. He was young for a marshal, even a deputy, but the frontier needed lawmen and took them where it could find them. "All right, Deputy Dawson," Victoria said, tucking the badge back into his pocket. "Here is what we are going to do. I am going to bind these wounds as best I can, and then I am going to go get my wagon and bring it back here. It is going to take me about an hour there and back, and I need you to promise me you will still be breathing when I return." His gray eyes found hers again, and despite the pain etched across his features, he managed the ghost of a smile. "Your voice," he said softly. "I heard your voice and the pain went away." Victoria felt something catch in her chest, a sensation she could not name and did not have time to examine. "Well, when I come back you will hear it again, so you just stay right here and wait for me." She worked quickly, binding his wounds with the strips of her apron and then her petticoat when the apron proved insufficient. She positioned him as comfortably as she could in the shade of a cottonwood tree, and made sure he had water from the creek in his canteen, which she had found still attached to his belt. Then she gathered her washing, abandoned and forgotten in her rush to save him, and stuffed it wet into her basket. "I will be back soon," she promised, and he nodded weakly, his eyes already drifting closed again. Victoria ran. She ran through the sagebrush and across the dried creek beds, her skirts clutched in her hands and her heart pounding not from exertion but from fear that he would be dead when she returned. She burst into the homestead yard 20 minutes later, gasping for breath, and found her father mending fence near the barn. "Pa," she shouted, and he looked up in alarm at her disheveled state. "Pa, I need the wagon and I need it right now. There is a man, a deputy marshal, shot and bleeding by the creek. We have to bring him back here." Samuel Keller was a practical man who had lived through enough frontier emergencies to know better than to waste time with questions. He hitched their 2 horses to the wagon in record time while Victoria grabbed blankets and what medical supplies they had in the house. Her mother appeared in the doorway, worry creasing her kind face. "Victoria, what has happened?" "No time, Mama," Victoria called as she climbed onto the wagon seat beside her father. "We will be back within the hour." The wagon jolted and bounced over the rough terrain, and Victoria directed her father toward the bend in the creek where she had left Brennan. With every passing minute, she expected to find him dead, expected to see his gray eyes closed forever, and the thought filled her with a dread she could not explain. She had known this man for perhaps 15 minutes total, most of which he had been unconscious, and yet the idea of losing him seemed unbearable. When they reached the cottonwood tree, she leaped from the wagon before it had fully stopped, rushing to where she had left him. He was still there, still breathing, though his face was even paler than before and his lips had taken on a bluish tinge that frightened her. "Brennan," she said, kneeling beside him and touching his face. His skin was cold despite the heat. "Brennan, we are here. We are going to get you to safety." His eyes opened, found her face, and that ghost of a smile returned. "Told you I would wait," he whispered. Samuel Keller was a strong man despite his 50 years, and between the two of them, they managed to get Brennan into the back of the wagon, though every movement drew groans of pain from him that made Victoria's heart ache. She climbed in beside him, cradling his head in her lap and pressing fresh bandages against his wounds while her father drove as quickly as he dared back toward the homestead. "Talk to me," Brennan said suddenly, his voice tight with pain. "Your voice helps." So Victoria talked. She told him about Provo, about the homestead, about her younger siblings and her mother's garden and her father's horses. She told him about the mountains that ringed the valley and how beautiful they were in winter when they were covered in snow. She talked about anything and everything, weaving a tapestry of words to distract him from his suffering, and she watched as his face relaxed fraction by fraction, the lines of agony smoothing as he focused on her voice rather than his wounds. By the time they reached the homestead, Martha Keller had prepared the spare bedroom and boiled water and laid out every clean cloth in the house. Samuel rode immediately into Provo to fetch Doc Morrison, while Victoria and her mother worked to clean Brennan's wounds properly. The bullet still lodged in his back worried Victoria most, but she did not dare try to remove it herself. "Who is he?" Martha asked as they worked, her practiced hands gentle despite the grim nature of the task. "Deputy Marshal Brennan Dawson," Victoria said. "The Dalton gang shot him." Martha's hands stilled for just a moment. "The Dalton gang is nothing but trouble and death. If they find out he survived and is here, they might come for him." "Then we will deal with that when the time comes," Victoria said firmly. "But I am not going to let him die, Mama." Her mother looked at her with knowing eyes, seeing something in Victoria's face that perhaps Victoria herself did not yet recognize. "No," Martha said softly. "I do not suppose you are." Doc Morrison arrived an hour later, a wizened man of 60 with steady hands and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He examined Brennan thoroughly, pursing his lips at the bullet still lodged near his spine, and finally sat back with a heavy sigh. "The two that went through are not the problem," he said. "Missed anything vital, lucky as that is, but this third one is sitting dangerous close to his spine. I can try to remove it, but there is a real chance I could leave him paralyzed or worse. On the other hand, leaving it in could lead to infection or other complications down the road." "What do you recommend?" Samuel asked. Doc Morrison looked at Brennan, who had been drifting in and out of consciousness throughout the examination. "If he were my son, I would take it out. The risk of leaving it is greater than the risk of the surgery, in my opinion. But he is the one who has to live with the consequences either way, so it should be his choice." Victoria leaned close to Brennan, touching his shoulder gently until his eyes opened and focused on her. "Brennan, can you hear me? The doctor needs to remove the bullet, but he says there are risks. Do you understand? Do it," Brennan said without hesitation. "Cannot be much worse than getting shot in the first place." The surgery took 2 hours, and Victoria refused to leave the room despite her mother's suggestions that she spare herself the sight. She held Brennan's hand when the pain became too much, talking to him in a low voice, telling him stories about growing up in Utah and learning to ride, and the time she accidentally let all her father's chickens loose and spent an entire day catching them. She talked until her throat was dry and her voice was hoarse, and through it all his hand gripped hers with a strength that seemed impossible for someone in his condition. When Doc Morrison finally held up the misshapen bullet, extracted from where it had lodged against Brennan's shoulder blade, Victoria felt tears of relief sliding down her cheeks. The doctor cleaned and stitched the wound with practiced efficiency, then bound Brennan's entire torso in clean bandages. "He will need constant care for at least a week," Doc Morrison said as he washed his hands in the basin Martha provided. "Someone will need to check his wounds twice daily for signs of infection, change his bandages, make sure he drinks enough water and gets some food in him when he is able. After that, if he survives the first week, his chances improve considerably. But I will be honest with you folks, he has lost a great deal of blood and suffered significant trauma. The next few days will tell us whether he is strong enough to pull through." "I will take care of him," Victoria said immediately, and 4 pairs of eyes turned toward her. She lifted her chin, meeting her father's gaze squarely. "I found him. I brought him here. I will see this through." Samuel and Martha exchanged a long look, one of those wordless conversations that people married for 30 years could have, and then her father nodded. "All right then. But you will accept help when you need it. Understood?" "Understood," Victoria agreed. Doc Morrison left instructions and promised to return in 2 days to check on his patient. After he departed, Martha shooed Victoria out of the sick room long enough to eat dinner and change into a fresh dress. But Victoria returned as soon as she was able, pulling a chair close to Brennan's bedside and settling in for what she suspected would be a long night. He slept fitfully, his body fighting the fever that Doc Morrison had warned would likely come. Victoria kept cool cloths on his forehead and changed them frequently, monitoring his breathing and the seepage from his wounds. Around midnight his fever spiked and he began to thrash and mutter, caught in the grip of some nightmare. "No," he mumbled, his head turning from side to side on the pillow. "No, get down, get down." Victoria caught his hands before he could tear at his bandages. "Brennan, it is all right. You are safe. You are in Provo at the Keller homestead. The Dalton gang cannot hurt you here." Her voice seemed to cut through whatever horror was playing out behind his closed eyelids. His thrashing stilled, and though he did not wake, his breathing evened out and his body relaxed back into the mattress. Victoria continued to hold his hand, her thumb tracing gentle circles over his knuckles, and she began to talk again in a low voice, telling him about the stars she could see through the window and how bright they were out here away from the city lights. For 3 days and nights, Victoria maintained her vigil. Her mother and younger sister Clara helped when they could, but it was Victoria's voice that Brennan responded to, Victoria's presence that seemed to calm him when the fever and pain became too much. She learned the rhythm of his breathing, could tell by the set of his shoulders when he was in pain even before he made a sound, and discovered that reading to him from her father's collection of books seemed to soothe him even when he was unconscious. On the 4th day, the fever finally broke. Victoria woke from an uncomfortable doze in her chair to find Brennan's gray eyes watching her, lucid and aware for the first time since the surgery. "You stayed," he said, his voice rough from disuse but stronger than it had been. Victoria sat up quickly, reaching for the water glass on the bedside table. "Of course I stayed. Here, drink this slowly." She helped him take a few sips, supporting his head carefully, and then eased him back down onto the pillows. His color was better, she noted with relief, the deathly pallor replaced by a more natural tone, and his eyes were clear and focused. "How long?" he asked. "4 days since we brought you here, 5 since I found you at the creek," Victoria said. "The doctor removed the bullet, and you have been fighting off fever and infection ever since, but you are going to be all right. Thanks to you." He tried to shift position and immediately grimaced in pain. Victoria helped him adjust, her hands gentle but competent as she arranged the pillows to support his injured back. "You should rest," she said. "Save your strength for healing." "Been resting for 4 days, apparently," Brennan said, and there was a hint of humor in his voice that made Victoria smile despite her exhaustion. "Rather hear you talk, if it is all the same to you. Your voice is the only thing that makes the pain bearable." Victoria felt that strange catch in her chest again, that flutter of something she was beginning to recognize as more than simple compassion for an injured man. "What do you want to hear about?" "You," he said simply. "Tell me about Victoria Keller." So she did. Over the course of that long afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the window and painted golden rectangles on the floor, Victoria told Brennan about herself. She told him about growing up the oldest of 4 children, about how she had learned to shoot and ride almost before she could walk, about her love of reading and her dream of someday seeing the ocean. She told him about the loneliness of frontier life and the beauty of it in equal measure, about watching the valley change with the seasons, and knowing that this land, harsh and unforgiving as it could be, was home. In return, when he had the strength, Brennan told her about himself. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had died when Brennan was 16, leaving him to care for his mother and 3 younger sisters. He had worked any job he could find, from ranch hand to stable boy to freight driver, sending money home until his sisters were old enough to care for themselves. When his mother remarried 2 years ago, Brennan had finally been free to pursue his own path, and he had headed west with dreams of becoming a lawman. "Guess I am not very good at it, seeing as I got myself shot within 6 months," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "You are alive," Victoria countered. "That counts for something." "Only because you found me," Brennan said, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "If you had not come to the creek when you did, if you had not heard your voice calling me back, I would be dead. No question about it." "Well then," Victoria said, trying to lighten the suddenly weighted atmosphere, "I suppose it is fortunate that I had laundry to do." He laughed, then groaned as the movement pulled at his wounds. "Do not make me laugh, hurts too much." "Then I will have to be very serious and boring from now on," Victoria said, but she was smiling as she adjusted his bandages and checked his wounds for any signs of infection. They were healing well, she was pleased to see, the angry red beginning to fade to pink. Over the next week, Brennan's strength slowly returned. He graduated from lying flat on his back to sitting propped up against pillows, and then to sitting in a chair by the window for short periods. Victoria remained his primary caregiver, and they fell into an easy companionship that felt at once brand new and comfortably familiar. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, discovering shared opinions on some topics and friendly disagreements on others. Brennan had a dry sense of humor that surprised her, and a thoughtful intelligence that she appreciated. Victoria found herself looking forward to their conversations, found herself thinking about him even when she was doing other tasks, and the realization of what was happening should have frightened her, but somehow did not. On the 10th day after she had found him, Brennan was strong enough to walk the short distance from his bed to the porch with Samuel's assistance. Victoria brought him coffee and sat beside him on the bench, both of them looking out at the mountains that rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat in the valley. "Beautiful country," Brennan said quietly. "It is," Victoria agreed. "I cannot imagine living anywhere else." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again his voice was careful, measured. "Victoria, I need to talk to you about what happens next." Something in his tone made her stomach tighten with apprehension, but she kept her voice calm. "All right." "The Dalton gang shot me because I was tracking them," Brennan said. "And they are still out there, still robbing and killing. As soon as I am well enough, it is my duty to go after them again." "That is suicide," Victoria said flatly. "They nearly killed you once already." "Which is why this time I will be smarter about it," Brennan said. "I will not go alone. I will get backup, organize a proper posse. But I cannot just let them keep terrorizing people, Victoria. It is my job to stop them." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that his job was not worth his life, but she understood duty, and she understood the kind of man Brennan was. He would not be the person she had come to care for if he were the type to turn away from danger simply because it was dangerous. "When?" she asked instead. "Doc Morrison is coming tomorrow to check my progress," Brennan said. "If he clears me for travel, I will need to head back to the marshal's office in Salt Lake City, file my report, and organize that posse. Probably 3 or 4 days if I am being honest about my condition." 3 or 4 days. The thought of him leaving, of returning to the empty space that had existed before she found him bleeding by the creek, felt like a physical blow. But Victoria Keller had been raised to be practical and strong, so she simply nodded and took a sip of her coffee. "You will need supplies for the journey," she said. "I will help you put together what you need." Brennan's hand found hers on the bench between them, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both bold and entirely natural. "Victoria, He trailed off, seeming to search for words, and Victoria turned to look at him. His gray eyes were intense, filled with something that made her heart race. "I know it has only been a short time," he said finally. "I know that, under normal circumstances, a man would court a woman properly, would take his time and do things right. But these are not normal circumstances, and I need you to know that these past 10 days, getting to know you, listening to your voice and watching the way you care for people, and the way your whole face lights up when you talk about something you love, it has meant everything to me. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and when I leave here, I am going to spend every minute thinking about you and figuring out how to come back to you." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "Brennan Dawson, are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am saying that I am falling in love with you," he said simply. "And I know I have no right to ask you to wait for me, no right to ask you for anything when I cannot promise you I will survive going after the Dalton gang, but I am asking anyway. Will you wait for me, Victoria?" She did not need to think about her answer. "I already started falling the moment you opened your eyes by the creek and looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. So yes, Brennan Dawson, I will wait for you, but you have to promise me you will come back." "I promise," he said, and then he leaned forward, slowly and carefully because of his injuries, and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and tasted like coffee and promises. And when they finally pulled apart, Victoria rested her forehead against his and breathed in the simple fact of his presence, committing it to memory against the days ahead when he would be gone. Doc Morrison declared Brennan fit to travel 2 days later, though he cautioned against any strenuous activity for at least another month. Brennan listened to the instructions with the patience of someone who had no intention of following them, and Victoria saw the determination settling over him like armor as he prepared to leave. Samuel provided a horse and saddle along with supplies for the journey, refusing Brennan's attempts at payment. "You are a lawman doing your duty," Samuel said gruffly. "And you made my daughter happier than I have seen her in a long while. That is payment enough." The morning Brennan was set to leave, Victoria walked with him to where his horse waited, saddled and ready. He moved stiffly still, his back not yet fully healed, and she could see him trying to hide the pain the movement caused. "You do not have to do this right now," she said quietly. "You could stay another week, make sure you are fully healed." "We both know that if I stay another week I will never want to leave," Brennan said, taking her hands in his. "And the longer I wait, the colder the trail gets on the Dalton gang. I have to do this, Victoria, but I will come back to you. I swear it." She helped him mount, steadying him as he settled gingerly into the saddle, and then she stepped back and looked up at him. He was silhouetted against the morning sun, hat pulled low over his gray eyes, and he looked every inch the lawman he was. But when he looked down at her, his expression softened into something tender and private. "I love you, Victoria Keller," he said. "And when I come back, I am going to ask your father for permission to court you properly." "He will say yes," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. "And so will I." Brennan tipped his hat to her, then turned his horse and rode out of the yard. Victoria stood watching until he disappeared around the bend in the road, one hand pressed against her heart as if she could physically hold the ache inside. The next 3 weeks were the longest of Victoria's life. She threw herself into work, helping her father with the horses, helping her mother with the household, taking on extra chores to keep herself busy and her mind occupied. But every night she lay in bed and wondered where Brennan was, whether he was safe, whether he was thinking of her the way she constantly thought of him. News trickled in through town slowly. The Dalton gang had robbed a stage near the Nevada border. A posse had been formed out of Salt Lake City, led by a deputy marshal. There had been a shootout near an old mining camp. 3 outlaws dead, 2 captured, the rest scattered to the wind. And then silence. Victoria waited. She waited through the end of June and into July, through the celebration of Independence Day and the height of summer when the valley baked under the relentless sun. She waited and she worried and she prayed, and she kept her promise to Brennan even though she had no way of knowing if he was keeping his promise to return. It was the 3rd week of July when she heard the sound of hoofbeats coming up the road to the homestead. Victoria had been hanging laundry in the yard, and she shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun to see a lone rider approaching. Her heart began to pound even before she could make out his features, some instinct telling her what her eyes had not yet confirmed. Brennan. He was thinner than when he had left, his face weathered and tired, but he was alive and he was here and he was riding straight toward her. Victoria dropped the sheet she had been hanging and ran to meet him, her skirts flying behind her. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, and then she was in his arms and he was holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and neither of them cared that she was crying, or that he was laughing, or that her entire family had come out onto the porch to witness their reunion. "You came back," she said against his chest. "You came back to me." "I promised," Brennan said, pulling back just enough to cup her face in his hands. "I will always come back to you, Victoria, always." He kissed her there in the yard with her family watching, and the sun beating down and the mountains standing as silent witnesses, and it felt like coming home. That evening, after Brennan had cleaned up and eaten, and told them the whole story of tracking down the Dalton gang and the final confrontation that had left the gang broken and scattered, he sat with Samuel on the porch while Victoria and her mother pretended not to be listening from inside the house. "Sir, I would like to ask your permission to court your daughter," Brennan said. his voice formal despite the nerves Victoria could hear threading through it. "I know I am just a deputy marshal without much to my name, and I know Victoria deserves better than what I can offer right now, but I love her and I intend to do right by her if you will let me." There was a long pause, and Victoria held her breath. "My daughter is the finest person I know," Samuel said finally. "Smart and strong and capable of making her own decisions. If she has chosen you, then she has chosen well. You have my permission, Brennan Dawson, and my blessing too." Victoria did not wait to hear more. She burst out onto the porch and threw her arms around her father, kissing his weathered cheek, and then turned to Brennan with eyes shining with joy. "I believe we have some courting to do, Deputy Dawson," she said. "I believe we do, Miss Keller," he agreed and offered her his arm. The courtship that followed was everything Victoria had never known she wanted. Brennan had been granted a month's leave to recover fully from his injuries, and he spent nearly every day of it at the Keller homestead. They took long walks through the valley, Victoria showing him all her favorite places and Brennan sharing stories of his travels and the people he had met. They sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains while they talked about their dreams and hopes for the future. Brennan helped Samuel with the horses and proved himself handy with repairs around the homestead, and Martha declared him a perfect gentleman and an excellent match for her daughter. But beyond all of that, beyond the propriety and the careful chaperoning and the politeness expected of a proper courtship, there were moments of startling intimacy that took Victoria's breath away. The way Brennan would seek out her hand whenever they walked, his fingers intertwining with hers as naturally as breathing. The way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, his gray eyes soft with an emotion that made her heart race. The way he listened when she talked, really listened, as if her words were the most important thing in the world. One evening as they sat by the creek where Victoria had first found him, Brennan turned to her with sudden seriousness. "I have been thinking about the future," he said. "About what happens when my leave is over and I have to report back to Salt Lake City." Victoria's stomach tightened, though she had known this conversation was coming. And I have a few options," Brennan said. "I could request a transfer to the Provo area. There is talk of establishing a permanent marshal's office here as the town grows. It would mean less pay, at least at first, but it would mean I could stay close to you." "What is the other option?" Victoria asked, though part of her did not want to know. "I could continue working out of Salt Lake City," he said. "It is better pay and more opportunity for advancement, but it would mean being away from you more often, sometimes for weeks at a time. I do not like that option, but I want to be honest about it." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, watching the creek burble over the same rocks where she had knelt and begged Brennan to stay alive. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want to marry you," Brennan said, and the directness of it made her turn to stare at him. "I want to build a life with you here in Provo, raise a family, grow old watching the seasons change in this valley. I want to come home to you every night and wake up beside you every morning. I want everything with you, Victoria." "Then ask me," she whispered, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Brennan slid off the rock where they had been sitting and knelt in front of her, taking both her hands in his. "Victoria Keller, I know we have not known each other long by conventional standards, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." He pulled her down into his arms and kissed her, and the creek sang its approval as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Provo. Victoria wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her, and carried wildflowers that her sister had picked from the meadow behind the homestead. Brennan wore a new suit that had taken a significant portion of his savings, and when he saw Victoria walking down the aisle on her father's arm, his eyes filled with tears. The ceremony was short and sweet, attended by Victoria's family and a handful of Brennan's fellow lawmen who had made the trip from Salt Lake City. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Brennan kissed her, the small church erupted in cheers and applause. True to his word, Brennan had requested and received a transfer to Provo. The marshal's office was small, just him and one other deputy for the time being, but it was honest work and it kept him close to home. They rented a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy but clean and sturdy with a view of the mountains that Victoria loved. Brennan built her bookshelves for the growing collection of books she accumulated, and Victoria made the house into a home with curtains and rugs, and the kind of touches that turned four walls into a sanctuary. Their first year of marriage was not without its challenges. Brennan's work was dangerous, and there were nights when Victoria lay awake waiting for him to come home, terrified that she would receive news that he had been injured or worse. But he always came home, sometimes battered and exhausted but always alive, and she learned to trust in his competence and his promise to always return to her. For his part, Brennan discovered that Victoria was not content to simply keep house and wait for him. She had opinions about his cases, often insightful ones, and more than once her suggestions had helped him solve a problem he had been wrestling with. She also proved to be an excellent shot with a rifle, a skill she had downplayed during their courtship, and Brennan made sure she knew how to defend herself when he was away. They fell into a rhythm, a partnership that was as much about friendship and mutual respect as it was about love and passion. They worked side by side to build their life, saving money carefully and planning for the future. Brennan began to talk about buying land, maybe starting a small ranch where he could raise horses when he eventually retired from law enforcement. Victoria dreamed of a bigger house, one with room for the children she hoped they would have someday. That someday came sooner than expected. 15 months after their wedding, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. She told Brennan over dinner, watching nervously as a whole range of emotions crossed his face in rapid succession. Surprise, wonder, joy, and finally a kind of awed terror that made her laugh. "I am going to be a father," he said, as if testing the words. "You are going to be a wonderful father," Victoria corrected, reaching across the table to take his hand. The pregnancy was not easy. Victoria suffered from terrible morning sickness for the first 3 months, and Brennan learned to cook basic meals and take over more of the household tasks to help ease her burden. As her belly grew, so did his protectiveness, to the point where Victoria had to firmly tell him that she was pregnant, not made of glass, and fully capable of continuing her normal activities. But when she went into labor on a cold February night in 1880, all of Brennan's fears came rushing to the surface. The midwife arrived and promptly kicked him out of the bedroom, relegating him to pacing the kitchen while Victoria labored. He heard her cries of pain, and it nearly drove him mad, but he remembered what she had told him about her voice being what pulled him back from the edge when he was injured. So he stood outside the bedroom door and talked to her. He told her how much he loved her, how brave she was, how proud he was to be her husband. He told her about the cradle he had built for the baby and the dreams he had for their family. He talked until his voice was hoarse, and when he finally heard the thin wail of a newborn baby, he nearly collapsed with relief. The midwife opened the door with a tired smile. "You have a son, Deputy Dawson, a healthy, loud son, and your wife is asking for you." Brennan entered the bedroom to find Victoria propped up against pillows, exhausted and pale but radiant as she cradled a tiny bundle in her arms. She looked up at him with eyes shining with love and accomplishment. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Brennan approached on shaking legs and looked down at the baby in her arms. He was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. He was the most beautiful thing Brennan had ever seen aside from his wife. "What should we name him?" Victoria asked. They had discussed names for months without coming to any firm decision, but looking at his son, Brennan suddenly knew. "Samuel," he said, "after your father, if that is all right with you." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "It is perfect." Little Samuel Dawson proved to be as demanding as any newborn, and the first few months were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings. But Brennan dove into fatherhood with the same dedication he brought to everything else, learning to change diapers and soothe a crying baby with surprising skill. Victoria watched him cradle their son and sing lullabies in his rough voice, and she fell in love with him all over again. As Samuel grew, so did their family in other ways. Brennan's reputation as a fair and effective lawman led to a promotion, and he was made marshal of Provo's growing law enforcement office. The increase in pay allowed them to buy a small plot of land on the outskirts of town, and they began to build the house and ranch that they had dreamed about. It was hard work, accomplished in stolen hours and weekends, but slowly their vision took shape. When Samuel was 2 years old, Victoria became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and when she gave birth to a daughter in the spring of 1883, Brennan wept openly at the sight of her. They named her Clara, after Victoria's sister, and she had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. Life settled into a new normal, one filled with the chaos and joy of small children. Samuel was curious and fearless, constantly getting into trouble despite his parents' best efforts at supervision. Clara was quieter but equally stubborn, with a will of iron hidden beneath her sweet exterior. Brennan proved to be a patient and loving father, and Victoria discovered reserves of strength and humor she had not known she possessed. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. They acquired horses and eventually some cattle, and Brennan hired help to manage things when his law enforcement duties kept him busy. Victoria managed the household and the books, proving to have a head for numbers that complemented Brennan's practical skills. They made a good team, always had, and their partnership only deepened with time. But even in their happiness, the shadow of Brennan's dangerous work was never far away. There were close calls, times when he came home injured or when word reached Victoria of a shootout or a chase that had gone wrong. Each time, she waited with her heart in her throat until she saw him ride up to the house, and each time he held her and promised her he would always come back. It was a promise he almost could not keep in the summer of 1885. A gang of outlaws had been terrorizing the smaller towns east of Provo, and Brennan led a posse to track them down. The confrontation turned into a gunfight, and Brennan took a bullet to the leg that shattered his thigh bone and nearly cost him his life. When they brought him home on a stretcher, pale and unconscious from blood loss, Victoria felt something inside her crack. She had found him bleeding once before and nursed him back to health, but this time there were 2 small children who needed their father, a ranch that needed managing, and a future that suddenly seemed terrifyingly uncertain. Doc Morrison, now in his 70s but still practicing, set the leg and told Victoria plainly that Brennan would live but would likely walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Law enforcement work of the active kind was probably out of the question. "Tell that to him," Victoria said, looking at her husband's face, still too pale against the white pillows. When Brennan finally woke, in pain and groggy from laudanum, the first thing he saw was Victoria's face. She was older than the girl who had found him by the creek 7 years ago, her face showing the marks of motherhood and hard work and worry. But to Brennan, she had never been more beautiful. "Did not keep my promise," he mumbled. "Got hurt again." "But you came back," Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. "You always come back to me." "Always," Brennan agreed, and then he noticed the fear in her eyes, the fear she was trying to hide. "What is it?" "The doctor says you will not be able to work as a marshal anymore," Victoria said quietly. "Not in the field, anyway." Brennan was quiet for a long moment, processing this. His work had defined him for so long, had been such a central part of his identity, that the thought of giving it up was almost incomprehensible. But then he thought about his wife and his children, about the ranch they were building and the life they had created together, and he realized that his identity had shifted years ago. He was not just a lawman anymore. He was a husband and a father first, and there was no shame in prioritizing that. "Then I guess it is time for a change," he said finally. "We have the ranch, we can make that work." "Are you sure?" Victoria asked. "I know how much being a marshal means to you." "It meant everything to me," Brennan corrected gently, "before I had everything else. You and Samuel and Clara and this life we have built, that is what matters now. The rest is just details." His recovery was long and painful, complicated by an infection that set in despite their best efforts. For weeks, Victoria nursed him, just as she had done years ago, talking to him and caring for him, and refusing to let him give up when the pain became too much. And just as before, her voice and her presence pulled him through. By autumn, Brennan was back on his feet, though Doc Morrison had been right about the limp. He walked with a cane now, his right leg never quite working the way it had before. The territorial government offered him a position as a magistrate, a job that used his knowledge and experience without requiring physical confrontation. Brennan accepted, and found that he enjoyed the work more than he had expected. He could make a difference, could uphold justice, without putting his life at constant risk. The ranch thrived under their joint management. They bred quality horses that became known throughout the territory, and their small herd of cattle provided steady income. Samuel, now 7 years old, was already showing an aptitude for working with animals, and little Clara followed her brother everywhere, determined to do everything he did. On a warm evening in June of 1886, Brennan and Victoria sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Samuel and Clara were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. 8 years had passed since Victoria had found Brennan bleeding by the creek, 8 years that had been filled with more joy and struggle and love than she could have imagined. "You ever think about that day?" Brennan asked, as if reading her thoughts. "The day you found me." "All the time," Victoria admitted. "I think about how different everything would be if I had decided to do laundry a different day, or if I had gone to a different part of the creek. All the little choices that led to that moment. I think about waking up and seeing your face," Brennan said, "and hearing your voice. I was in so much pain, but when I heard you talking to me, it all just faded away. You were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and I remember thinking that if I died right then, at least the last thing I saw would be something worth seeing." Victoria reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining automatically after years of practice. "You promised me you would wait, and you kept that promise." "I have kept all my promises to you," Brennan said, "and I will keep making them for the rest of my life." "What promises are you making now?" Victoria asked, smiling. "I promise to love you every day for the rest of my life," Brennan said seriously. I promise to be the best husband and father I can be. I promise to build this ranch into something we can be proud of and pass down to our children. And I promise that no matter what happens, I will always come back to you." "Those are good promises," Victoria said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I promise to love you just as fiercely as I did the day I found you by the creek. I promise to be your partner in everything. And I promise to always be here waiting when you come home." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play, and the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. The future stretched out before them, full of unknowns and possibilities, but they would face it together as they had faced everything else. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing of seasons and the growth of their children. Samuel grew tall and serious, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's quiet determination. He learned the law from Brennan and the practicalities of running a ranch from both his parents, and by the time he was 18, he was an invaluable partner in the family business. Clara, true to her stubborn nature, refused to be confined by the expectations of what a young woman should be. She could ride as well as any man, could shoot better than most, and had inherited her mother's sharp intelligence and her father's sense of justice. Victoria and Brennan quietly supported her unconventional interests, knowing that trying to force her into a traditional mold would only make her miserable. In 1891, when Samuel was 21 and Clara was 18, the family gathered to celebrate Brennan and Victoria's 13th wedding anniversary. The ranch had expanded significantly, now employing several hands and producing some of the finest horses in Utah. Brennan had been appointed as a territorial judge, a position of significant respect and influence. Victoria had become known in Provo as a woman of substance, serving on various civic committees and quietly advocating for education and women's rights. But more than any of their external accomplishments, what mattered most to both of them was the family they had built. Samuel had recently begun courting a young woman from town, a school teacher named Emily, who had impressed both his parents with her intelligence and kindness. Clara showed no interest in marriage yet, more focused on learning everything she could about horse breeding and ranch management. "We did all right," Brennan said to Victoria that night after their children had gone to bed, and they sat alone on the porch, a ritual they had maintained for years. "Did not we? We did better than all right," Victoria corrected, nestled against his side with his arm around her shoulders. "We built something real and lasting. We raised good children. We loved each other through everything." "Still do," Brennan said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Still falling more in love with you every day." Victoria thought about the young woman she had been at 20, kneeling by a creek and finding a stranger bleeding in the water. She thought about the fear and the determination that had driven her to save him, never imagining that, in saving his life, she would be setting the course for her own. She thought about every moment since, the good and the bad, the joy and the struggle, and she could not imagine having lived any other life. "I would do it all again," she said quietly. "Every single moment. I would choose you every time." "Good," Brennan said, his voice rough with emotion. "Because I would choose you too. From that first moment I opened my eyes and saw you. I was yours. I will always be yours." They sat together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other by chance and stayed together by choice. The creek where their story had begun still flowed through the valley, its waters singing the same song they had sung 13 years ago. But now that song was part of a larger symphony, one that included children's laughter and horses neighing and the sounds of a life well lived. The future would bring its own challenges and changes. Samuel would marry Emily 2 years later, and they would give Brennan and Victoria their first grandchild, a boy named Brennan Samuel Dawson, in in 1894. Clara would eventually fall in love with an unexpected partner, a journalist from back east who came to write about the changing West and stayed for the rancher's daughter who captivated him. The ranch would continue to grow and evolve, adapting to the changing times as the frontier era slowly gave way to a more settled existence. But through all of it, through decades of life and love and the inevitable losses that come with time, Brennan and Victoria remained each other's constant. They had started with a moment of crisis by a creek, with pain and fear and a voice that called someone back from the edge of death. They had built on that foundation something extraordinary, a partnership of equals, a love that deepened rather than faded with time, a family that carried their values forward into the next generation. When Victoria was in her 70s and Brennan in his late 70s, they would sometimes make the trip out to the creek where their story had begun. The land around it had changed, Provo having grown from a small frontier town into a thriving city, but the creek itself remained much the same. They would sit on the bank, holding hands, and remember, "You think you would have looked at me twice if we had met under normal circumstances?" Brennan asked once during one of these visits, his hair white now and his gray eyes faded but still sharp with intelligence. "I think I would have looked at you 3 times at least," Victoria said, her own hair silver and her face lined with years of laughter and tears. "You were very handsome, even bleeding and unconscious." He laughed, the sound as warm and genuine as it had been 50 years earlier. "You were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Still are." "Flatterer," Victoria said, but she was smiling. "Truth teller," Brennan corrected. "You saved my life that day, Victoria, not just by stopping the bleeding or getting me to a doctor, but by giving me something worth living for. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Victoria said, squeezing his hand. "That is how love works, Brennan. It is not one person saving another. It is 2 people choosing each other and building something together." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the creek and the wind in the cottonwoods and the distant sounds of the city that had grown up around them. Their children were grown with children of their own. The ranch was being run by Samuel and his family, and Brennan and Victoria had earned their rest. But they were still here, still together, still finding joy in each other's company after more than 50 years of marriage. "I kept my promise," Brennan said softly. "I always came back to you." "You did," Victoria agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder just as she had done countless times before. "And I always waited. We made a good team, Brennan Dawson." "The best team," he agreed. "Do you have any regrets?" "Anything you wish had been different?" Victoria thought about it, really thought about it, reviewing decades of memories. There had been hard times, certainly. Losses and disappointments and fears that had tested them. But even those difficult moments had been part of the tapestry of their life together, threads that added depth and texture to the overall pattern. "No regrets," she said finally. "Not a single one. If I could go back and change anything, I would not, because it might change where we ended up. And where we ended up is exactly where I want to be." "With me," Brennan said, and it was not quite a question. "Always with you," Victoria confirmed. "From the moment I found you bleeding by this creek until the moment we take our last breaths, I choose you. I will always choose you." He kissed her then, a soft press of lips that held 50 years of love and commitment and partnership. When they pulled apart, both of them had tears in their eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that come from overwhelming gratitude for a life well lived and deeply loved. They stayed by the creek until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, just as it had done on the day they got engaged. Then Brennan helped Victoria to her feet, moving slowly because his old wounds ached in the evening chill, and her joints were not what they used to be, and they walked hand in hand back to the buggy that would take them home. Home to the ranch they had built together, where their family waited and their legacy lived on in the children and grandchildren who carried their names and their values forward. Home to the life they had created from a chance encounter, and a voice that had called someone back from the edge of death. Home to each other as they always had been and always would be. The story that had begun with a woman finding a cowboy bleeding by the creek, with him waking to her voice and forgetting about the pain, had become a story about so much more than that initial moment of crisis. It had become a story about choice and commitment, about building something lasting from a foundation of mutual respect and love, about two people who had found each other against all odds and refused to let go. As they drove away from the creek that evening, the water continued its endless song, flowing toward distant seas just as it had for countless years before, and would for countless years to come. But for one moment in time, it had brought two souls together, and from that meeting had sprung a love story for the ages. Brennan and Victoria lived out their days surrounded by family and friends, secure in the knowledge that they had loved well and been loved in return. When Brennan passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, Victoria held his hand and whispered one last time that she loved him, that she would see him again, that this was not truly goodbye but just a temporary parting. She followed him 3 years later, having lived to see great-grandchildren born and the ranch celebrated as one of the finest in Utah. Her last words, spoken to Samuel who sat vigil by her bedside, were about the creek and the day she had found his father. "I heard the water singing," she said softly, her eyes distant with memory. "And I knew I had to go there that day. It was like something was calling me. And when I found him, when he opened his eyes and looked at me, I knew my whole life had just changed. Tell your children that story, Samuel. Tell them about how love can come from the most unexpected places, and how if you are brave enough to reach for it, it can last a lifetime." "I will, Mama," Samuel promised, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I will make sure everyone knows." And he did. The story of Brennan and Victoria Dawson became a cherished family legend, passed down through generations. The creek where they met was eventually designated as a historic site, a small plaque marking it as the place where one of Provo's founding families had begun. Young couples would sometimes visit it, hoping that the magic that had brought Brennan and Victoria together might bless their own relationships. But the real magic had never been in the place itself. It had been in two people who looked at each other across the space of injury and pain and saw possibility. It had been in a voice that called someone back from the brink, and in the man who heard that voice and chose to fight for life. It had been in 50-plus years of choosing each other, day after day, through everything that life threw at them. That was the real story. Not just of how she found a cowboy bleeding by the creek, or how he woke to her voice and forgot about the pain, but of everything that came after. Of the life they built, and the love they shared, and the legacy they left behind. It was a story of the American West in all its harsh beauty and rough promise. But more than that, it was a story of the human heart and its capacity for love that endures beyond reason, beyond hardship, beyond even death itself. And in a small cemetery on a hillside overlooking the valley they had called home, two headstones stood side by side, their inscriptions simple but profound: Brennan Dawson, 1854-1936. Beloved husband, father, grandfather, he always came back, Victoria Keller Dawson, 1858-1939. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she always waited, together forever as they had always meant to be.